We are recording the meeting. So what we've done during the course of these few days is to take a very careful look at how detective fiction has progressed and what have been the theories and major concerns of detective fiction. We have also looked at the formation of Agatha Christie's Poirot and the way in which Poirot has been given a distinctive identity. I hope you can see my screen right now. Can you?
Yes, sir. Visible.
Yes, sir.
It's visible, right. And let me put it on full screen so that you can all take a look at it. Just give me a moment. So we have taken a look at the ways in which the form has moved. We've made distinctions between the classical whodunit and the other forms of detective fiction, the hard-boiled detective fiction. We've talked about the typologies. We've talked about the amateur detective and his role in bringing justice. We've talked about the ideology of the form. We've tried broadly to put it as part of popular culture in the sense that it caters to pleasure, one. Secondly, that it is repetitive in its usage of a certain formula. And thirdly, that in its ideologies, it tries to preserve the given social penal world order. Now, the murder of Roger Ackroyd has a few critical points, which I'll discuss today. This is more of a folding up lecture, so that in our next discussion, we can sort of look at the possible questions that might be asked. Now, this, interestingly, is a series of 6 stamps that were released on Agatha Christie. So this is the British Mail actually having released the stamp. And you can see, very interestingly, that right. And you could see very interestingly that there is this chair which is placed so that the entire the stamp has the chair before the fireplace. Sorry. Has the stamp before the fireplace and shows the letter, which is a very important motif in this text. And you will remember that this high back chair and the movement of this chair was an important integral part of Hercule Poirot detecting the crime. Right. What have we actually taken a look at? We've talked about popular culture, how it has emerged. We have talked about Walter Benjamin and the loss of the aura of art, the mechanical reproduction of culture and film, whereby the aura of the author is lost. Of course, Agatha Christie is writing at a point of time where she still is able, through her own detective, to add her own aura into literature. Right. That is one part of the discussion that we have talked about. Now, in the next part, we've talked about Benjamin's, once again, concept of the age of mechanical reproduction, having separated art from its basis in cult. We have talked about the concept of Adorno and Horkheimer and how popular culture becomes a culture industry, right? Where cultural products, where texts become cultural products meant for consumption, and it is marked by repetition and standardization of the structure. Now we'll have to see how classical detective fiction sort of maintains the aura of a certain kind of a uniqueness. Yet, if you look at it very carefully, detective fiction, classical whodunit, is more or less something which is standardized. And then we have we have talked about how the expectations of the detective fiction move. There's also been this theory about the game that detective fiction, especially the whodunit, is a game that is played between the author and the reader. It has certain codes of understanding. It has certain set rules. It has an aim in producing a kind of a pleasure and is accompanied by a feeling of tension, joy, and consciousness that it is different from ordinary life. When you're reading detective fiction, you are not reading ordinary life in that sense of the term. Now, it's very interesting that a game has 6 features: presence of at least 2 players, in this case, the author and the reader, emerging new situations, changes, red herrings, etc., change in moves, how the detective finds the clues, information levels that keep on varying, so you're gradually fed information, termination of roles, and a payoff for each player. So at the end of the detective fiction, you have to find the criminal. You have to know who the criminal is. If the story ends without a criminal or without the resolution, then the game has not been completed. I will not go into Lyotard, but very importantly, you have to note that while detective fiction is a slightly newer genre, crime has been one of the integral parts of the novel from its very inception, right? That, there was scarcely a major 19th century work that did not in some way concern itself with legality and deviance, and that the genre, and this is a work which has been pioneered by John Bender, he suggests that in trying to create a plot, the novel tries to create a legal boundary, a kind of a control over the chaotic social experience. অর্থাৎ দেখো, সোসাইটি তো chaotic, essentially অনেক কিছু ঘটছে, কিন্তু যে মুহূর্তে তুমি নভেল লিখছো সে মুহূর্তে you are setting a kind of an order and a boundary within which the novel functions. অর্থাৎ নভেলের প্লট কনস্ট্রাকশনের মধ্যেই একটা এক ধরনের you have a kind of a boundary setting, a kind of a policing. Now, this brings me to my major point, which I made with all of you. The philosophical background of the detective fiction goes back to the Enlightenment, the search for truth, the importance of rationality, and the importance of a method of rationality, right? Now, the detective follows a method, and this is Descartes. Descartes, what are Descartes' precepts when he talks about discourse on method and the way in which one sort of approaches the truth? Descartes কি বলছেন, what are the steps? এটা লক্ষ্য রাখো এই কারণে যে these are also the dictums of the detective. অর্থাৎ Descartes' প্রথম precept কি? That never to accept anything for true which I did not clearly know to be such. So you cannot accept anything as true until and unless you are convinced that that is absolutely true, that there are no exceptions. Sorry, just give me a moment. Second is that to divide each of the difficulties under examination into as many parts as possible, right? So the detective must break down the problem into its constituent parts to look for its solution. The third, to conduct my thoughts in such order that by commencing with objects the simplest and easiest to know, I might ascend by little and little. So clues, inferences, first hypothesis, second hypothesis, right? Assigning in thought a certain order even to those objects which in their own nature do not stand in relation of antecedents and sequence, right? So the most important aspect of the detective is not only reason, but the proper method through which reason is executed. And in the last, in every case, to make enumerations so complete that and reviews so general that I might be assured that nothing was omitted. So, the solution of detective fiction must be such that there can be no inadequacies or no mistakes, no inconsistencies in the pattern of reasoning. The crime must be tied in such a way, that everything is explained, that there is nothing that is not explained. This is what detective fiction or the method of the detective must be. বুঝতে পেরেছো আমি কেন ডেকার্ট এত ডিটেলসে বলছি? বিকজ তুমি দেখো এইটাই কিন্তু এই ফিলোসফিক্যাল আউটলুকটাই কিন্তু is the method of the detective. And you can see how Agatha Christie continuously talks about method of exercising the little gray cells. Right. These are the features of detective fiction. Van Diemet থেকে নেওয়া, crime is committed, variety of suspects, central character acts as the detective collects evidence, interviews the suspect, solves the mystery and indicates the real criminal, and the criminal is now arrested and punished. This punishment is also, this arrest and handing over to justice is equally important for the preservation of status quo. Right. The crime has to be apparently insoluble. It is a paradox. Right. And what Conan Doyle said when he was working on Sherlock Holmes, he said that the manner of detective fiction is working back from the effect. অর্থাৎ ক্রাইমটা হচ্ছে effect. The crime is the effect to the cause, to how the crime is committed and why the crime is committed. So the detective answers three basic questions. Why is the crime committed? This is motive. How is the crime committed? This is method. And who commits the crime? That is the identity of the criminal, from solution to the problem, right? So manner of working back from effect to cause, from solution to problem. এই কারণেই I have told you that the detective fiction has two stories. One is the story of the crime, which is antecedent, মানে আগে ক্রাইমটা হয়ে গেছে. And the second is the story of the detection of the crime, which follows, and where the detective is the hero. In the story of the committing of the crime, the protagonist is the criminal. And in the story of the finding of the criminal, the detective is the hero. So these are the two narratives of detective fiction. And the effect is the crime, and the narrative action consists in working back from the crime to identify the cause and the perpetrator of crime. There must be a formal process of detection consisting of investigation, deduction, and revelation. অর্থাৎ ডিটেকটিভ এলো, এসে বললো আমি ধ্যান করেছিলাম, আমাকে ভগবান বলে দিয়েছেন যে এই হচ্ছে ক্রিমিনাল, হবে না। You have to have a formal process of investigation, deduction, and revelation. Right. Now, the detective is in very ways an amateur, right? Somebody who's not a professional policeman. Although you can say that in Christie's case, it is slightly different because Hercule Poirot was supposedly a policeman in the Belgian police force, right? Amateur in the sense of not being a member of an official police force. But he's a professional in the sense that he handles the case very nicely. Right? Sometimes, very often, an official policeman also, this becomes the police procedural, right? The possession on the part of a detective of a vast knowledge base. So the detective has to know about poison, he has to know about certain weapons, for example, so that he can fall back upon that and solve the crime. যে কোন রিভলভার থেকে কোন গুলি ছুটতে পারে, অর্থাৎ অথবা Hercule Poirot বারবার বলছেন যে কোন পয়জনে কি কি সিম্পটমস হতে পারে. So the detective has to have that scientific knowledge base. And what is important, a last pointer, is that he has exceptional mental powers, right? He has to be a superhero cerebrally, right? He has to have powers which no other character in the novel must have. And he is very often also eccentric in some way. This is where he is distinguished, right? He is, you see, we've already said that detective fiction is very often extremely formulaic. So how does one make or sort of distinguish the detective from the other characters? He's distinguishable because of certain physical features, but primarily by his exceptional intelligence. Now, there is an official police force which is often uncooperative and incompetent, if not downright stupid, right? You have Lestrade, you have Inspector Japp. The intelligence of the detective is played out against the non-intelligence of these officers. The detective's confidant, in this case, assistant, in this case, Dr. Shepherd, and that is the magic of this particular story. A suspect who appears to be guilty, Ralph Payton, from the circumstantial evidence or a variety of credible suspects. You have Ralph Payton or Charles Kent, right? So variety of credible suspects, significant quantity of irrelevant information. এখানেও কিন্তু অনেক রকম প্লট দেওয়া আছে, চার্লস কেন্টস প্লট, Ralph Payton's plot. So you have multiple plots, irrelevant information from which the relevant information must be gathered, and a resolution which is often startling and unexpected. The resolution often involves or implies the bringing of the culprit to justice. So these are the features of detective fiction. We talked about the typologies also. The prototype typical detective would have been Sherlock Holmes, but we have two kinds. One is the classical whodunit, right, which is a considered more traditional lowbrow, performs a conservative ideological function. Everything turns out to be right at the end. A close story with a happy ending that makes good reading and provides reassuring security to the reader that society will continue in the form the reader knows and likes. For the detective hero is always there to protect society from subversive attacks perpetrated by evildoers of every possible kind. This is the first whodunit, the classical whodunit. The second is what we call the hard-boiled detective fiction. The more critical one is which it functions antithetical to mainstream crime writing, varying from a critique of society to a debunking of the classic detective genre, right? This has been experimented with by a lot of people, including Kafka, Borges, Alan Robert Grillet's France, and the feminists and black writing, for example. Now, let me turn for a very brief moment to this fictional private detective, this category, right? He has a new professional role. The fictional private detective is a professional in the sense that he solves crime not for fun, right? Only Miss Marple solves the crimes for fun or without any money. Hercule Poirot, Feluda, Bomkesh Bokshi accept a fee. No longer is the police detective nor the professional or amateur private detective. He is himself what is called the consulting detective. You come to consult him for a particular problem by paying a fee. So in a certain sense, he is outside the traditional legal force, but performs the function of the legal force. He symbolizes very often, this is very interesting, the middle class, market-oriented professional striving to create and maintain socio-economic status. অর্থাৎ আমি যেমন পড়াচ্ছি, I'm a professional in that sense of the term. The detective is also a professional. He is performing a function, but he's middle class. এটা লক্ষ্য করে দেখো কিন্তু, মানে বিরাট বড়লোক ডিটেকটিভ তুমি পাবে না. All these detectives depend upon their fees for a living. He does not represent the assault of the middle class against the aristocracy, but the living token that the middle class has conquered his place in society. and therefore the aristocrats will come to him with their problem, and the aristocrats respect this middle class professional. অর্থাৎ এটা কিন্তু মনে রাখবে যে the detective accepts his middle class status, his status is accepted by society, and that the aristocrats will also, all classes of people will also come to this middle class professional for solving their problems. Orthat detective, the fictional detective, is an acceptable middle class protagonist marked by his cerebral abilities. আরেকটা প্রশ্ন, why murder? এটা আমি বারবার করে তোমাদের বলেছি যে অধিকাংশ ডিটেকটিভ ফিকশন talks about murder because this crime carries an atavistic weight of repugnance, fascination and fear. মানে এটা মাথায় রেখো, ক্রাইমেরও তো তারতম্য আছে, চুরি, ছিটকে চুরি, এগুলো খুব কমন, রাইট? কিন্তু মার্ডার ইজ দ্যাট অ্যাক্ট where you are taking a life which is fearful, which is fascinating, and yet which causes tremendous repugnance within us, right? This is the ultimate act of desecrating your soul, as it were, because a person cannot be revived. চুরি করলে সে টাকা তুমি ফেরত দিতে পারো, উদ্ধার করতে পারো, কিন্তু খুন করলে তার জীবনটা নিয়ে আসতে পারো না, which makes murder the most thrilling crime. আচ্ছা, এগুলো কয়েকটা ছবি আমি তোমাদের জন্য জোগাড় করেছিলাম. This is the handwriting of the master, as it were, Arthur Conan Doyle. Interestingly, the first female detective is published in 1864. So you can see that even before Conan Doyle has started to write, detection is already there as a form. অর্থাৎ কোনান ডয়েল এটাকে আবিষ্কার কিন্তু করেননি, রাইট? এই ফর্মটা আস্তে আস্তে it was coming into circulation. Now Miss Marple makes this first appearance in a journal and in a magazine rather, I'm sorry. এবং এই প্রথম যে গল্পটা বেরিয়েছিল সেখানে দেখো মিস মার্পলের প্রথম ছবি আমরা দেখতে পাচ্ছি. মিস মার্পল ইজ নিটিং and she's an old lady. আগাথা ক্রিস্টির এইখানেই কিন্তু ইনোভেশন. She is bringing a female detective, not only a female detective, but somebody who is very unlike a female detective, right? Unlike a detective. Very important quotes from Agatha Christie. It's the brain, the little grey cells on which one must rely. One must see the truth within, not without. That's Poirot, the little grey cells that are so important. Now, Poirot is, of course, marked by his vanity. আচ্ছা, আমি ওই ছবিটা তোমাদের কাছে একটু দেখিয়েছি, কারণ Poirot is marked by, যেটাকে আমি বলবো, an obsessive compulsive disorder. Obsessive compulsive কাদেরকে বলা হয়? যারা কোনো জিনিস এদিক থেকে ওদিক করতে দেয় না, অর্থাৎ এভরিথিং মাস্ট বি স্পিক অ্যান্ড স্প্যান। দেখবে তোমাদের মধ্যেও অনেকে আছে যাদের টেবিলটা, ঘরটা প্রচন্ড গুছানো, রাইট? সমস্ত জিনিসটা ঠিক জায়গায় রাখা হয়, রাইট? তুমি সেই জায়গায় যদি না থাকে তাহলে তুমি সেইগুলোকে ঠিক করে দেবে, তুমি কিছুতেই ভুল ভ্রান্তিগুলোকে অ্যাকসেপ্ট করতে পারবে না। দিস পিপল আর অবসেসিভ কম্পালসিভ ইন আ সার্টেন ওয়ে। আবার অনেকে আছে যাদের মানে সমস্তটাই অগোছালো, রাইট? সো এরকিউল পোয়ারট দেখো অ্যাপিয়ারেন্সটা ইজ ইমপেকেবল, সবসময় গোঁফ দুটো একদম পাকানো, একদম অয়েলড এন্ড এক্সেপশনালি ট্রিমড। ওই জন্য ডক্টর শেফার্ড বলছেন না, উই থট হি ওয়াজ আ হেয়ার ড্রেসার। আচ্ছা, ইম্যাকুলেটলি ড্রেসড। আচ্ছা, আরেকটা জিনিস একটু দেখতে হবে আমাদের, why is Hercule Poirot not British? Now, this is very interesting that Agatha Christie creates Hercule Poirot as a Belgian protagonist, right? As a Belgian and who has a funny accent. So in a certain way, what I'm trying to suggest is that there is a kind of a fun which is being made on, or Hercule Poirot becomes an outsider, right? Who can make a fun, or who can provide a comic perspective to the British identity in a certain way. So there are two humors here. One is a humor which is directed against Hercule Poirot, who seems to be extremely vain, comic, has a funny accent, so he's the outsider. So the British making fun at the outsider. And on the other hand, because he solves the British crimes, Hercule Poirot again makes fun of the British stiff upper lip, British customs, and so on. অর্থাৎ দেখো, একটা জিনিস তোমাদের মাথায় রাখতে হবে, কিন্তু Agatha Christie is making the detective within society yet without society, মানে একটু outsider, কিন্তু who solves the problems of the inside society. অর্থাৎ সে ব্রিটিশ হয়ে গেছে, কিন্তু তার একটা আলাদা সত্তা আছে যেটা বেলজিয়ান, রাইট? সো এই যে লিমিনাল স্ট্যাটাস, লিমিনাল মানে কি মাঝামাঝি, that he is both an insider and an outsider to society. He is both part of the crime solving official procedure yet not the police force. এই যে মধ্যবর্তী জায়গাটা, এই যে গ্রে এরিয়া, that liminal status is very important for the detective. This is David Suchet, the man who played Poirot. অর্থাৎ Poirot কিরকম দেখতে হবে দেখো, এই যে বলছিলাম immaculately dressed, তুমি দেখো bow tie, মাথায় টুপি, immaculate coat, right? You have the moustache, for example. যদি টুপিটা খোলা হতো দেখতে egg-shaped oval head. মাথায় রেখো, David Suchet acted in almost all the BBC productions of Hercule Poirot. He was almost the Poirot, হাতে ওই walking stick, right? So therefore, আবার বলছি, obsessive compulsive, great attention to particular details, always immaculately dressed. This is the fashionable Hercule Poirot, right? Interestingly, now Hercule Poirot is being played by a major Hollywood actor called Kenneth Branagh. আমি এই ছবিটা একটু আরেকবার দেখাচ্ছি। এটা হচ্ছে the earlier Hercule Poirot. This is the man who is playing Poirot now, Kenneth Branagh. এবং দেখো, ওই যে ছবিটা আমি তোমাকে দেখিয়েছি, এখানে there are several rehearsals that Kenneth Branagh did to conceptualize Hercule Poirot. ওই যে মুস্টাশটা তুমি দেখতে পাচ্ছ, coat immaculate, the walking stick, the shoes, the dress. একটাই শুধু পার্থক্য এখানে আছে, সেটা হচ্ছে Hercule Poirot has hair, whereas in the earlier David Suchet variety, Suchet, Hercule Poirot had a bald, egg-shaped head. কেন? Why do I point this out? আমি বারবার বলছি যে Agatha Christie was aware that she was writing a formulaic fiction and that she was using a stock prototype of the detective. But she was aware that to gather the interest of the readers, she had to give the detective a salient, unique identity. A salient, unique identity is being given by the physical attributes and the vanity of Hercule Poirot, right? The physical attributes of Hercule Poirot. অর্থাৎ এর মাধ্যমে Agatha Christie is both individualizing him as well as making him part of the stock detective canon, right? আচ্ছা, interestingly, Agatha Christie's সময় Agatha Christie কিভাবে বুক কভার গুলো দিয়েছেন দেখো, right? This is one of the first editions, এবং এখানে Agatha Christie কিন্তু কোনো ফেস দিচ্ছেন না. What he's giving is that hat and that moustache, right? So this is how Agatha Christie wanted to distinguish Poirot. How many novels? 33 novels, 59 short stories, and one original play by Agatha Christie. 3 continuation novels by Sophie Hannah. He will return in August 2020. He has already returned. And the last novel that Sophie Hannah, এগুলোকে বলা হয় continuation novels, সেটা already published হয়ে গেছে, right? But জীবিত অবস্থায় Agatha Christie wrote 33 Poirot novels and 59 short stories. Now, my question, which I've already answered to you, is why is the detective so distinctive? Because the author is aware that he's writing a formulaic fiction, yet he has to add a degree of individualism and uniqueness, which will mark his detective separated from the other detectives. তোমাদের আমি বলেছিলাম ডিটেকশন ক্লাব চলছে সেই সময়, এভরিবডি ইজ রাইটিং ডিটেকটিভ ফিকশন, অর্থাৎ আমরা 51 জন লিখতে শুরু করলাম কিন্তু একজন ডিটেকটিভই থেকে গেল, কেননা তাকে আমরা একটা দারুণ নাম দিয়েছি, শার্লক হোমস, এরকুল পোয়ারো, রাইট, ব্যোমকেশ বক্সী, right? And we have given him a certain unique identity, right? Now, the Poirot's first appearance is in a novel called The Mysterious Affair at Styles, right? And he's described in these terms. He was hardly more than 5 feet 4 inches, but carried himself with great dignity. So the detective has, the possession of intelligence and dignity. Head was exactly the shape of an egg. The neatness of his attire was almost incredible. I believe a speck of dust would have caused him more pain than a bullet. ওই যে বারবার করে যেটা বলছিস, obsessive compulsive. The detective is also obsessive compulsive about the truth. He must find the entire truth. There will not be a speck of lie, right? That is the characteristic of the detective. He looked ridiculously full of his own importance, and therefore is a vain man. He always says, I am a hero. I am impeccable. I am the one and only Hercule Poirot, right? He's extremely vain. Protect detective has this confidence in his own intelligence. আচ্ছা, মিস মার্পলের কথাটা আমি একটু বলি, তার কারণ মিস মার্পল articulates the ideological position of the detective. কি বলছে? This is a wicked murderer, Inspector, and the wicked should not go unpunished. আমি বারবার করে তোমাদের যেটা বলেছি, that in detective fiction there is a crime, and the crime is a violation of the human code, and therefore it must be punished. এটা কিন্তু একটা legal framework, legal penal framework, right? এখানে কিন্তু we do not really get into morality, right? Miss Marple কিরকম? Once again very distinguished, fluffy and dithery in appearance, but inwardly as sharp and shrewd as they make them. অর্থাৎ ডিটেকটিভের হিরোইজমটা কিন্তু is not physical heroism, right? সেটা হার্ড বয়েলডে হতে পারে. The real heroism of the detective lies in his or her intellectual ability, right? And then she talks about, okay, let's come to the murder of Roger Ackroyd. এটার কতগুলো তথ্য তোমাদের দেওয়া হয়নি, সেগুলো আমি একটু দিয়ে নিই. Right. In 1938, Agatha Christie writes that The Murder of Roger Ackroyd is one of our favorite books because he was at his best investigating a crime in a quiet country village, এটাই হচ্ছে standard type, and using of knowledge of human nature to get at the truth. Right. Now, in 1977, in her autobiography, Agatha Christie suggested that the basic idea of the novel was given to her by her brother-in-law James Watt of Abney Hall, who suggested a novel in which the criminal would be a Dr. Watson character. Okay, so she was given the idea that why not make Dr. the confidant of the detective the criminal, which Agatha Christie considered to be a remarkably original thought. So she was bringing in a radical departure to the form in transforming the confidant into the criminal. Now, the novel was serialized in 54 parts, অর্থাৎ ভেঙে ভেঙে কতটা হয়েছিল দেখো, in the London Evening News from 16th July to Wednesday, 16th September 1925, right? সুতরাং you have a 54-part serialization, right? তোমরা দেশে দেখেছো ধারাবাহিক উপন্যাস বেরোয়, ঠিক সেইভাবে ধারাবাহিকভাবে বেরিয়েছিল. And the title was Who Killed Ackroyd? আচ্ছা, লোকেশনের কথাটা আমি তোমাদের বারবার করে বলেছি, বলা হচ্ছে কিংস আবাদ, লাইক এনি আদার ভিলেজ, রেলওয়ে স্টেশন, স্মল পোস্ট অফিস, টু রাইভাল জেনারেল স্টোর্স, রাইট? So this is a traditional county village in England which does not have the younger men. And you see, we've talked about the younger men as being susceptible to crime and weakness, whereas it is the more mature men who bring order and decency to the village. Our hobbies, of course, is gossip. So in a certain way, this is an incestual little village where people marry within the village, where all news is circulated as gossip. But gossip, you will remember, is an important source of information for the detective. Now, we've talked about the red herrings, Ralph Payton, Charles Kent, and Poirot says, it is extraordinarily intriguing, this whole thing. Every new development, I'm sorry, this is not Poirot, but this is Dr. Shepard, says every new development that arises is like a shake you give to the kaleidoscope. The thing changes entirely in its aspect. এটা কিন্তু ডিটেকটিভ ফিকশনের একটা ক্যারেক্টারিস্টিক, যে মাঝে মাঝেই তোমার মনে হতে পারে এও খুনি ও খুনি, এও খুনি ও খুনি, right? So, circumstances, new evidences always create a confusion. The kaleidoscope is confusing, right? So it is through this fog of confusion that the detective must provide the light of reason and solution, right? There is then, of course, the unreliable narrator and the phenomenon of narrative deception, right? যে প্যাসেজটা আমি তোমাদের বারবার বলছিলাম, বারবার পড়াচ্ছিলাম, right? The letter had been brought in at 20 minutes to 9. I left him the letter still unread, letter কিন্তু ওর পকেটে. I hesitated with my hand on the door handle, looking back and wondering if there was anything I had left undone. By this time, you know that he has already committed the murder. অর্থাৎ ডিটেকটিভ ফিকশনের দুটো রিডিং আছে. একটা রিডিং is when you do not know the identity of the murderer, but you will come back after knowing the identity of the murderer. You see all of this takes a new turn. So this is the originality. আমার এই PowerPoint প্রেজেন্টেশনটার টাইটেলটা ছিল Playing with the Form. How does Agatha Christie play with the form? The first play, and the most important play, is in making the detective, in making the confidant, the narrator, the crime, so that at every point there is a narrative deception which is played out on the reader. There is, of course, an idea of an overarching human nature. যে যেখানেই তুমি যাও না কেন, human nature is fundamentally the same. Certain types always tend to act in exactly the same way. The ideology of detective fiction, which we have talked about repeatedly, resolution of conflict, preservation of the status quo, that there is a recurrent conflict in this world, and uncertainty is the basic pattern. Styles is a nest of jealousy and unease. Roger Ackroyd's house is full of impostures and anxieties. অর্থাৎ আগাথা ক্রিস্টি বলছেন আমাদের সকলের মধ্যে there is a potential criminal. আমরা ছোটখাটো চুরি করতে পারি, আমরা মিথ্যে কথা বলতে পারি, আমরা কনস্পিরেসি করতে পারি, একে অন্যের বিরুদ্ধে বলতে পারি, right? So human nature is not very pleasant. It is extremely what you can call gray. It has shades of black within it, that within every character there is a potential criminal. Agatha Christie's criminals are traitors to the class and world, which is so calmly described, and their identification is a process. Eight খুব important. Why must the criminal be found out and exorcised? Exorcised মানে তার ভূত ছাড়াতে হবে, কেন তাকে অ্যারেস্ট করতে হবে? Because it is a process also of exorcising the threats that this society nervously anticipates within its own membership, right? অর্থাৎ সোসাইটি নিজেকে কন্ট্রোল করছে. That is what the law and the penal force has on us, right? আমরা আইনটা মানি কেন? আমরা আইনটা মানি যাতে আমরা সবাই সুস্থভাবে, সহজভাবে, ভালোভাবে বাঁচতে পারি, that there is no conflict. Otherwise তো সবাই ঢিসুম ঢিসুম করতাম নিজেদের মধ্যে. We must preserve the status quo so that nobody ruptures the agreement that we have. এরপরে আমি হবস পড়াবো, যেখানে আমি তোমাদের সোশ্যাল কন্ট্রাক্টের থিওরি বলবো. এটাই হচ্ছে সোশ্যাল কন্ট্রাক্ট, যে আমি তোমাকে আঘাত করব না. Now the criminal violates that social contract, and therefore his action must be exercised and punished so that that social contract, that of what we call the law, is maintained. The multiple suspect structure has special meaning in a competitive and individualist world. Detective fiction has often been compared with folklore, rupkathar sathe, right? So it explains the world, protects the folk against psychic and physical threats, which the criminal sort of provides, to offer escapist entertainment, and be socially normative, অর্থাৎ social normটাকে it preserves, to urge that these values will keep society on an even keel and resists disconcerting change. এখানেই কিন্তু আদর্নো and হর্কহাইমারের থিওরিতে আবার ফেরত যাও, and you see how Adorno and Horkheimer says that all popular literature is very often merely repetitive, merely reiterating the conventional social status quo, the social normative pattern. The question of class, Agatha Christie's characters are largely middle class and often leisured. Class consciousness is a feature. Very importantly, the hierarchy of this country house, where you have the lady or the lord of the house, you have the servants, the secretary, the friends, and the maid. So it's a very clearly demarcated social class within her fictions. So it's very important that, the class is an important constituent of Agatha Christie's novels. And when asked about her method, Agatha Christie said that you start with the wish to deceive. So the first thing that the detective must do is to play the game with the audience. But if the audience can understand who the criminal is, then it's not a good story. You won't read it again. So what you have to do is you have to create confusion and deception, and then work backwards to reveal the truth. This is the denouement, the final climax where the revelation occurs. And it says, this is the person who was at the Three Boars. This was the person who knew that Ackroyd had purchased a dictaphone. This is the person who had a black bag. This is the person who came to the scene of the crime while Parker was telephoning for the police. And therefore, this is Dr. Shepherd. So this is the denouement, the moment when the identity of the criminal is finally revealed, right? So, sorry, once again, let me come back. Yeah. So this is the denouement. These are the patterns and the themes that make Agatha Christie's novel what it is. And then, of course, comes in তোমাদের যে প্রশ্নটা খুব স্বাভাবিক এবং আসতেই পারে, সেটা হচ্ছে, what is the originality that Agatha Christie brings, and why is the murder of Roger Ackroyd so very significant, right? Because of this authorial deception. When the last dozen pages, the answer emerges, the reader will feel that he has been fairly or unfairly sold up, right? Because, you don't expect the narrator to be the criminal. Up till then, he has been balancing in his mind from chapter to chapter the probabilities for or against 8 or 9 persons at whom suspicion points. Everybody has a secret in this story. Everybody, Miss Russell, Mrs. Ackroyd, Flora Ackroyd, Ralph Payton, Charles Kent, of course, Dr. Shepherd. Everybody has a secret, and the production of which is imperative in fitting into place the pieces in the jigsaw puzzle. And in the end, it turns out the doctor himself is responsible for the largest bit of resistance. So the most important deception is practiced by the narrator. So this is where ultimately the author uses the narrator as the largest deceptor, and therefore plays a trick on the audience. And therefore the tale may be recommended as one of the cleverest and most original of its kind. Why is it radical in form? It's the supreme ultimate detective novel because it rests upon the most elegant of all twists, the narrator who is revealed to be the murderer. It is not a mere function of plot. It puts the whole concept of detective fiction on an armature and sculpts it into a dazzling new shape. So it is one of those Christie novels which make a pioneering departure. A pioneering departure, আমি বলবো, আগাথা ক্রিস্টি 3টে নভেলে করেছিলেন। এক, Murder of Roger Ackroyd; 2, the murder on the Orient Express; and 3rd, the ABC murders. Orient Express, there are 12 murderers. ABC murders say there is this concept of the serial murder to perpetrate the final act of murder. Third murderটা করার জন্য আগে দুটো র্যান্ডম মার্ডার। আরেকটা জায়গায় উনি করেছিলেন, যে নভেলটাকে প্রথমে বলা হয়েছিল 10 লিটল নিগার্স, অর্থাৎ একটা আইল্যান্ডে এক এক করে খুন হয়ে যাচ্ছে, রাইট? It was later on changed the title, niggers কথাটা হওয়ার ফলে she used the term title and then there were none, যেটা তোমরা মেহমুদের ওই একটা সিনেমা ছিল সেখানে তোমরা দেখেছো, মেহমুদের সিনেমাটার নামটা আমি ভুলে গেছি, কিন্তু সেটা একবার দেখে নিতে পারো to know the story. Now but one of the things I would like to point out is Agatha Christie often uses nursery rhymes in her tales. Hickory Dickory Dock bole or একটা novel আছে, right? In one of his novels he uses the nursery rhyme of the blackbird. So in a certain sense she is falling upon archetypal social myths and stories and then transforming them into scenes of crime and trying to solve them, right? So it was not an entirely new idea. So this is why I am saying that this is radical in form, because it is challenging the very basis of rule of detective fiction, that the confidant will not be a criminal and that the reader is always being taken for a ride. তুমি যে মোমেন্টে ডক্টর শেফার্ডকে বিশ্বাস করছো, and Dr. Shepherd being a doctor with a power of observation, accurate narrative, you are always being played upon by Agatha Christie, because at every point Dr. Shepherd is only releasing half the truth. The rest of the truth is going to be released by Hercule Poirot. It was not an entirely new idea, not was it entirely her own idea. আমরা দেখেছি যে ওকে এই আইডিয়াটা দেওয়া হয়েছিল, but here she realized was an idea worth having, and only she could have pulled it off so completely. Only she had the requisite control, the willingness to absent herself from the authorial scene. জায়গাটা ছেড়ে দিচ্ছেন authorial জায়গাটা to Dr. Shepherd. Omniscient narration নয় কিন্তু, this is a first person narrative of Dr. Shepherd, যার ওপরে hover করছে Agatha Christie and Hercule Poirot. So তিনটে layer of narrative. একটা layer Dr. Shepherd, second layer Hercule Poirot, who will expose the narrative of Dr. Shepherd. A third layer is Agatha Christie, who will control both these narratives of Poirot and Dr. Shepherd. এইখানেই narrative ingenuity, এইখানেই narrative complexity. But the point to ponder about detective fiction is, এবং আজও তুমি যখন পড়ছো Agatha Christie থেকে ব্যোমকেশ পড়ছো, the more you read, the more things remain the same in the classical whodunit, right? It is with that I bring this PowerPoint to a closure. It was part of a lecture that I had given earlier, but I wanted all of you to take a look at this, কারণ PowerPoint-এর একটা সুবিধা হচ্ছে খুব গুছিয়ে বলা যায়, মানে একটার পর একটা আমি স্লাইড দেখিয়ে I have just taken you through the entire rubric of all these classes that I have been taking with you, right? Now let me open this up for any comment or discussion that you would like to make. Yeah,
Dada,
go ahead.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
Debarpita from Sem 3. Okay. So Dada, I was going through an article on Hercule Poirot, and as you asked the question that why he is not an Englishman and a Belgian detective, the author gave an explanation in that particular essay, saying that when Agatha Christie was working as a nurse in Turkey, and as it was a war going on, many Belgian were coming from Belgium to England, and from them being inspired, she drew some sort of a detective from those Belgian udbastu, যেরকম ভাবে লেখা
Right,
ছিল,
refugees, right.
Yeah, refugees.
Yeah, that might be possible. Sorry, go ahead,
Okay,
please.
I'm just asking you the authenticity about that information. I'm not pretty sure, so I'm just asking you, is that pretty much authentic, or like she drew that character of the detective only to somewhat to make him distinguished from the stereotypical detective, somewhat
Right,
separate from
distinctive.
Sherlock Holmes?
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah.
I would agree with that. Because you see, while Agatha Christie would have been familiar with the Belgians, right? Uh, there would be, and you are absolutely right that she worked with as a nurse in Torquay. Torquay being one of those very picturesque towns in Devonshire. Now, but it is very difficult to say that any one particular soldier or any Belgian individual would have been the basis for Hercule Poirot. What we know most certainly is that Agatha Christie created two detectives. One who is very English, that is Miss Marple. Miss Marple eats cakes and scones. She's extremely, formally English in her behavior, right? And very old-fashioned English. Whereas Hercule Poirot, despite being Belgian, speaks with a French accent, all Belgians did at that point of time, and is somewhat of an outsider. Now, what I would like you to understand, one of the things that you pointed out, and I acknowledge that, is that he wants to make his detective stand out, not be ordinary, right? Therefore, find a name. How does one make a character extraordinary? You find a name for him. Hercule Poirot, something which you remember, like Sherlock Holmes, Byomkesh Bokshi, Kiriti Rai. You see, all these.
Dada Shucheta here. Sorry
Right.
for the interruption. I want to draw Debarpita's statement that I think that whenever on that time of World War, the refugees were settled down into that place where actually Agatha Christie lived. I think that the local people actually pitied them, the refugees. So I think that Agatha Christie have a kind of fact that they are not the people who should always get pitied or like that. So she actually made that character Belgian. Is it?
I wouldn't read so much into that, Shuchita. You see, once again, while she would have looked at a lot of Belgians, she would have looked at a lot of other people as well. There were French coming in, there were people from the Netherlands coming in. So, to say that, she was looking at a kind of a specific European identity, I would be a little hesitant to read so much into this. What I would try to suggest rather is that she realized that the detective was both within the structure of the law and outside the structure of the law. He was not the police. At the same time, he was not outside the legal structure as well. Therefore, whom does he choose? A retired Belgian police official. Eta kintu mathaye rekho. He's not a retired Belgian soldier. He's a retired Belgian police official. In fact, একটা বড় জায়গা আছে in this Kenneth Branagh film of The Murder on the Orient Express, বলা হচ্ছে যে what was Agatha, who was Poirot, or what was Poirot's original profession. এই সিনেমাটা একটু দেখতে পারো, তোমরা সবাই মিলে দেখতে পারো, ইন্ডিভিজুয়ালি দেখতে পারো, The Murder of the Orient Express এর latest version. তাতে দেখা যাচ্ছে Poirot was originally, মানে এটা কিন্তু সত্যি নয় আর কি, মানে সত্যি কি মিথ্যে আমি জানি না, but this is মানে what it is projected, that Poirot was a priest, right? And he tried to protect his flock during the war. And during the war, these people were mercilessly killed. Therefore, Poirot lost his faith, came to be a policeman, right? Now, আমরা জানি না who was the original Poirot. Agatha Christie কখনো স্পষ্ট করে বলেন, right? So whatever we say is conjecture. Yes, she came in contact with a lot of Belgians, but similarly she would have come into contact with a lot of other people. আমরা এইটা বলতে পারি যে ডিটেকটিভকে why is she placing him in a liminal position? কারণ তিনি পুলিশ সম্পর্কে জানেন, পয়জন সম্পর্কে জানেন, ক্রাইম সম্পর্কে জানেন, আবার at the same time she is not part of the police force, the official police force at all, right? Therefore this is what we can surmise, যে এই কারণে উনি ডিস্টিংগুইশ করতে চাইছেন, স্লাইটলি কমিক করতে চাইছেন। এবং এটা মাথায় রাখো একটা জিনিস, that none of these two protagonists are heroes in that sense of the term. That is to say, they are not physically distinguished. They are distinguished, they are slightly comic. Miss Marple তো মাঝে মাঝেই বলছেন আমি ভীষণ অবলা মহিলা, কিন্তু they are distinguished by the basis of their rationality and their ability to exercise this rationality. ঠিক আছে, এইভাবে আমরা ভাবি যে হ্যাঁ এদের ডিস্টিংগুইশ করতে, এদের একটা ইউনিকনেস দিতে, আবার একটা অল্টারনেটিভ কাইন্ড অফ হিরোইজম দেওয়ার জন্য। ঠিক আছে, আর কোনো প্রশ্ন আছে?
Dada, it's Nisha from St.
Yes.
I have gone through a journal where it said that the character of Miss Marple was inspired by Caroline, the shepherd's sister.
Yes.
And there are certain similarities between them. So, are the two characters linked with each other because they have some similarities, like they were they are of same age and like to gossip.
Right. Now, you see, that's a very good question. In fact, thank you for putting that question. I should have discussed it. There are two theories here. Not only is Caroline a prototype for Miss Marple, but there is a theory that Caroline is actually the murderer, and that she was the one who was sort of blackmailing Mrs. Ferrers. But the point remains that the clues and the fictions, the storyline does not support that, and that's again এগুলো স্পেকুলেশন। আমরা জানি না, হয়তো আরেকটা গল্প লেখা যেতে পারতো with Caroline as the murderer. কিন্তু which is very important is that there are two such women in Agatha Christie's novels who are surrogate figures for Miss Marple. One is a detective writer with whom lady detective writer with whom Agatha Christie Hercule Poirot interacts, and the other is Caroline. All of them rely on gossip as a source of information. All of them are extremely sharp old women who have a propensity of reading into the character of the criminal, right? Caroline, যেমন Dr. Shepherd has the suggestion that Caroline knows because she sees his weakness, right? That Caroline can read human nature. Caroline can discern that Mrs. Ferrers had actually murdered her husband and therefore has committed suicide, rather than this being a case of overdose. সুতরাং হ্যাঁ, ছায়া থাকতে পারে, and maybe we don't know. Maybe while working on Caroline, Agatha Christie thought about Miss Marple as a potential character. কিন্তু একটা জিনিস তোমাকে মাথায় রাখতে হবে, and that is the importance of your question, is that Agatha Christie, when it came to the concept of the detective, was gender neutral. She suggested that this, intelligence, which is the heroism of the detective, এটা পুরুষ মানুষের মধ্যে যেমন থাকতে পারে Hercule Poirot, it could also reside with Miss Marple, right? So it might have been a woman or a man, and Miss Marple is important because she's the first major female detective within detective fiction, and therefore Agatha Christie's intervention lies in the fact that the woman is as much capable as the man in solving the crime. বুঝতে পেরেছো? And the woman is more capable in a certain sense because she has access to information which the man does not. In that village setting, she's part of the entire milieu. Agatha Christie Poirot কিন্তু বাইরে থেকে আসছে, মিস মার্পল কিন্তু সেই গ্রামে থাকেন। আচ্ছা, আরেকটা জিনিস তোমাদের মাথায় রাখতে হবে, সেটা হচ্ছে এই propensity of Caroline and Miss Marple to fall back upon gossip, এবং গসিপের থেকে to understand that human nature in the town and the village are the same. that people are generally types and that they will behave very predictably across social spaces. মানে অর্থাৎ এই চরিত্রটা এই রকম, সে গ্রামে থাকলেও সেই রকম, শহরে থাকলেও সেই রকম। এটা আগাথা ক্রিস্টি খানিকটা তুমি বলতে পারো একটু জেনারেলাইজেশন করছেন, জেনারেলাইজেশন অ্যাবাউট হিউম্যান নেচার। কেন করছেন সেটার একটা বড় কারণ হচ্ছে এই, that Agatha Christie is doing this because she was not exposed to urban crime in the way the male writers were, and therefore she chooses to write in situations which were well known to her in aristocratic county houses. এই কারণে হয়তো মানে উনি এই ধরনের পার্টিকুলার ফিকশন গুলো লিখছেন, রাইট? কিন্তু you are right that there are shades of Miss Marple, and maybe she was inspired to create Miss Marple through the character of Caroline Shepherd, right? এই ধরনের চরিত্র কিন্তু the shrewd old woman who understands a lot of things based on her experience is a recurrent character in Agatha Christie. কে জানে, হয়তো নিজেকেই দেখছিলেন খানিকটা তার মধ্যে।
ওকে দাদা,
রাইট, থ্যাংক ইউ। আচ্ছা, আর প্রশ্ন আছে? বলো, দিস ইজ টার্নিং আউট টু বি এ প্রিটি ইন্টারঅ্যাক্টিভ ক্লাস। ঠিক আছে
Sir, I don't have a question, but rather I would like to seek your opinions on it. Sir, Agatha Christie was a nurse and also knew works of the pharmacists, and this turned out well, and she used poisons in many of her novels, like Stratchin, Curare, and Veronal. Curare. So, sir, how would you say to this? I mean,
yes, true, absolutely. Thank you for pointing it out. Agatha Christie's work as a nurse sort of gave her two important insights. One is this concept of the anatomy. So, you will see that most of her crimes take place with knives, for example, right? Sharp instruments. So she knew about the human anatomy. And the second is her crimes are often crimes of poison. Therefore, she knew exactly what the symptoms of strychnine or the symptoms of arsenic poisoning would be, what the symptoms of, as you point out, curare. Curare was a rather oriental poison, but in most cases it is arsenic or strychnine or nicotine poisoning that is the source of the murder. Absolutely. Thank you for pointing it out. I would also like to add to this, এটা আমি অতটা বলিনি, যে some of Agatha Christie's novels are also located in Egypt, because she had married an archaeologist, Max, and traveled with her husband, and therefore you have quite a large number of novels which are placed in the Middle East, where she traveled with her husband. এবং at a certain stretch আরেকটা জিনিসও বলতে পারি, that archaeology and the detection are almost the same, তাই না? Both of them dig out the past and try to recreate the past or the actions that have already taken place.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, if that is all, then I will bring this class to a close and I will stop the recording now. Acha. Kalke we have a lockdown.